good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever one it is for you. I am so glad that you are here joining me in another special event with a special guest, indeed, Professor Mark Aronoff. So, my dear participants, welcome. Uh, would you kindly mute your yeah? Would you kindly mute your microphone so that we can start, please? Thank you so much, and I do appreciate your help. Okay, so thanks for joining me uh, for this special night with Professor Mark Aronoff. So I'm really honored to uh, introduce him, Professor Mark Aronoff. You know, I guess many of you uh, will already know his name. He's one of the most respected voices in the study of morphology. Uh, Professor Aronoff has spent his whole entire career at Stony Brook University, I believe, where he's been teaching, mentoring, and shaping the field since the 1970s, if I'm not wrong. Uh, Over the years, his written works that have become classics in morphology, and he's constantly shown how this area connects to the bigger picture of language, from syntax and phonology to semantics, and even the way mind is process words. Has also been a leader in the field more broadly, serving as editor of language, leading the Linguistics Society of America as its president, and being recognized as a fellow of major academic societies. But beyond all the titles, what really stands out is how he has, kept asking the simple but powerful question: what is that makes words work the way they do? So, my dear participants, so it's a true privilege for us to have him here with us tonight to share his ideas, his experiences, his visions for the future of linguistics. Professor Mark Aronoff, if you can hear me, hello and welcome.
Hi, well, thank you. It really is a great honor, and especially just looking at all of these names here, just appreciating the global nature of the audience. We're really, I mean, when I left the house this morning, I said to my wife, "Well, I'm going to Kurdistan." Right? I'm going to Iraqi Kurdistan today, which of course is not, this is something that really I think one of the really positive aspects of modern technology.
Yes.
So thank you for this.
Well, thank you so much once more. I will waste no more time and start with the questions, if you don't mind. So,
Sure.
Professor, looking back at your early years in linguistics, I mean, what first drew you to the field, and why did morphology become your lifelong focus?
Sure. Thank you. Well, I think my interest in linguistics uh, comes from the fact that I was surrounded by many languages from a very young age. Um, so I grew up in Montreal, in Canada, and I grew up in a neighborhood um, that was, I would say, a largely immigrant neighborhood. And there were many, many different immigrant communities. So I remember as a child, I would be sent to the grocery store, and I would each community had its own grocery store, and so I would be sent to to the Italian grocery store to buy olives, and I would be sent to the Greek grocery store to buy feta cheese, and I would be sent to the Jewish grocery store to buy herring. And so we were just and of course this was in Montreal, so there were two languages that were sort of pervaded everything, that were English and French. My mother I always tell this, people don't believe this, but my mother grew up on a farm in Canada, north of Montreal, maybe 50 kilometers north of Montreal. And for the first 6 years of her life, she spoke only Yiddish, and then spoke English, learned English when she went to school. So I was completely surrounded by all these different languages. And then when I went to school, and in particular, I went to a high school that was what is called a Hebrew day school, which is something that I don't know if it exists in many other places other than in North America, but you have your regular school curriculum, which is in English and French, and in addition to that, um, you have classes that are taught in Hebrew. That you speak Hebrew in the classroom, and of course you also have religious classes where you learn to read biblical Hebrew, and you also learn to read Aramaic. And of course we also had Latin, because in high school, if you were respectable, you had to learn Latin. And so I just was completely surrounded by these many languages. And when I went to university, which was also Montreal, at the McGill University in Montreal, I had this theory, which I still believe in. I gave this advice to my children about this, that what you do when you go to university, the subject matter doesn't matter. What matters is the number of students there are compared to professors. So you find a department that has many professors and very few students. And that way you'll get the best education because you get the most attention. So my son, for example, when he went to university, he studied physics and logic because there were no students at the undergraduate level who were interested in physics and logic. He went on to become a lawyer, but that was not the point. And the same, I have one of my daughters, she studied geology because people were not interested in geology. So that was the best field. So when I first started at university, I studied classics. So I studied Latin and Greek for a couple of years in university. And then they started a linguistics department and they had no students. And so I said, "Oh, well, that's the right thing because I'll get completely individual attention." And I had studied so many different languages that I began to slowly figure out I'm not interested in the languages. That's not what I care about. I'm interested in how they work. And so I think that was it was this exposure in starting in childhood to many languages, and then the realization that you could it wasn't so much studying the languages as studying how they work. And that's people ask me, "Oh, you're a linguist. How many languages do you speak?" And I tell them, no, that's not what it's about. It's about figuring out how they work. So that's a very, very long answer to how I got interested in linguistics. How I got interested in morphology, and I've actually written about this so people can look at it. So I went to MIT for my PhD. And I went to MIT for my PhD because, I applied to various places and, all in the United States. And I was admitted to MIT. I was admitted to other places too, but I was admitted to MIT and they said, we'll support you, we'll give you some money. And I knew it was the best place. So I didn't know anything about phonology or syntax. I knew nothing about phonology or syntax, which is what they worked on there. But I went to MIT, and it was great. But basically, at the time, which was the early 1970s, at MIT in linguistics, you could study phonology or you could study syntax. That was all that they had. Nothing else existed. They didn't have semantics, and there was phonetics, but phonetics was actually in a totally separate department in electrical engineering. They were great phoneticians, but not in linguistics. And so, in your first year, you had to study both phonology and syntax, and you had to write an independent paper, on both phonology and syntax. And I discovered that I really didn't understand syntax at all. I still don't understand syntax. I have no idea what it's about. Doesn't it's sort of, and that I really that so that okay, so I wasn't going to do syntax. And then I discovered I didn't really like phonology. I just didn't, I wasn't of interest to me. And so I said, now what am I going to do? And so and I'm not sure how this happened, but I started thinking about certain types of English words, in particular English words with Latin derived structure, and I had studied Latin from a very young age. And so I began to notice patterns there, and I said to myself, oh, that's what I'm interested in. That's sort of what I really, that's what I do. Nobody was doing it. I mean, there was like people, I mean, Halley had written one paper on morphology, but at the time it was, and Chomsky had, of course, written his remarks on nominalization, which is about morphology, and he had done just a little bit of an aspect. But I just said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And so I think I spent a year just reading all of the classic works in morphology from the American structuralists, from the Europeans, Saussure, and said, okay, yeah, that's what that's I like this stuff, and it's so we were discussing beforehand, what you should do what you like. You should do what you think, what interests you. Don't worry about other people. Just do what interests you. And I remember when I was in graduate school that one of my fellow students said to me, why are you doing morphology? You'll never get a job because nobody does morphology. You'll never get a job. And your hair is much too long. I had very long hair because it was the 1970s, and that was, if you were cool, you had long hair. They said so you have to you have to cut your hair if you want to get a job. That's the first thing you have to do, and the second thing is you have to find something else besides morphology. And then luckily, but I did morphology. That's what I did. I wrote a dissertation in morphology, and luckily, there was somebody here at Stony Brook. Then they had a 1-year job. And this one guy he was fascinated. He said, Frank Anchin was his name. He said, I find it's very interesting. You were a product of MIT, but you like to count. That was the other thing that I figured out. I like sort of statistical types of things. I liked that. I just thought it was fascinating. And he said, so they gave me a 1-year job here because he thought, well, this is an interesting guy. He comes from MIT, but he likes to count, so he's an interesting guy. And then, as I say, they forgot about me. And that was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And so I'm still here. So that's a very long answer to your first question.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting, Professor. But you have just mentioned it, Professor Chomsky and Halley. So the question is that how did working under Morris Halley and engaging with early generative linguistics shape your academic outlook?
Yeah, no, I thought about that, and that's a great question. Of course, when I went there, it was still really, I mean, generative grammar. I think so. I started there in 1970, and sound aspects had been published 65. Sound patterns have been published 68. So it was really kind of and to me, the what I think was most important to me was two things. One is that they took you seriously. they sort of that everybody was respected, and that you were, you got there and they said, okay, you're going to do serious work and you're going to make important contributions. So that was important. And the other, and you were a real community. It was a community of people who felt that people, okay, you're doing important work. I mean, I think sometimes it was too, people thought it was too important. I mean, they didn't think that anything else was important, which I'll tell you that in a minute. So that, and the other thing was that they really wanted to hear what you had to say. And so, I mean, you would go into Morris's office and he would say, okay, argue with me. That was his most famous phrase, argue with me. And you would stand there in front of the blackboard and you would have to argue. You would go to Chomsky, anybody could go in to see Chomsky. It wasn't, you wouldn't see him very often, but you would go and see Chomsky. Chomsky was like a professional wrestler. He would pick you up and throw you on the ground. Anything, I mean, he would destroy you, completely destroy you. And you would take you months to recover, but you felt that he was doing this as kind of like, like he was your wrestling coach, right? He felt that this was his goal, was to just slam you to the ground as hard as he could to strengthen you, right? So to me, that was the sort of the most important aspect of it, was this sense of being, trained, right? Now, on the downside, I will say that they didn't believe that anything else was of any value. No other kind of linguistics was of any value. And I remember the graduate students believed that. So at one point, somebody suggested that Bill LeBove come to give a lecture. And a bunch of graduate students went to Morris Howley and said, how can you permit this? This man is a heretic. He doesn't, his religion is the wrong religion. How can you permit this man to actually come and speak? Right? Now, to their credit, they did permit him to come and speak. But there was an atmosphere there that people at MIT, they were doing God's work and nobody else was doing God's work, right? That was I think the downside to it. And I think I was permitted to do morphology because somehow they believed that, well, what I was doing was somehow bringing morphology into generative grammar. I don't think I was, to tell you the truth. I mean, so my dissertation, the published version, is called Word Formation in Generative Grammar, but that wasn't the title that I gave it. It was actually Jay Kaiser, who was the editor of Linguistics for MIT Press, and mine was the first book that they published. He said, okay, we're going to give it this title. We're going to call it Word Formation in Generative Grammar. And I think it was a great bit of public relations, because he said, okay, you guys, you're doing generative grammar. This guy's doing word formation. So and I contributed to this by sort of trying to phrase it as, in terms of generative grammar. But they really would not, as I said, it was part of the atmosphere, was that the only things that you could do would be, you could do semantics, yeah, but it had to be, within the framework, right? That's changed a lot. The field is not like that at all anymore, but that's what it was like. So yeah, that's a long answer again to your question.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, you are lucky, among these whole people, Professor Chomsky, Morris Halley. So, Professor Aronoff, over the decades, you have helped with different modern morphological theory. So the question is that, what do you consider your most important theoretical contribution?
That's funny. So a few years ago, there was a book published that and I can't, the book is somewhere back here, but I can't remember the exact title of the book. But it took some piece of data and it took several theories and tried to sort of show how these theories would apply to this data. And I remember I got the book and I opened it up and I said, "Oh my God, I hope I'm not there." And that was because I never felt that that sort of that the theory was the most important aspect of what I was doing. It's and I still believe that um, that um, that it's more not so much a theory as kind of a, a way of trying to understand the data. And so, what I would say, if you ask me what is my most important contribution, is the idea that there's something there in the data, and you don't know what it is. So I try not to come with, but the goal is to understand what is there. That's the goal. And if you can help to understand, then that's what most important. And so, I mean, my favorite example of that, I would say, is if you look at syntactic structures and look at Chomsky's analysis of English verbs in syntactic structures, that to me uh, is is a great work of morphology, and that's because what he did was he looked at this. He said, "Look, I can show you how these work. That with affix hopping and all of that stuff." He said, "I can show you, and I can help you to understand the structure that's there." And when you read his analysis of English verbs in syntactic structures, you say to yourself, "Yeah, that's right. That's I see something there that I didn't see before." And so to me, that's kind of what I'm always looking for is, okay, can I show you something there and can I show you that it's there with and you can appreciate it. And so it's not so much the theory as the kind of understanding in some sense, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is really interesting. I mean, all this experience. So, Professor Aronoff, how has the field of morphology changed since 1970s? I mean, and where do you see your ideas like morphological autonomy standing today?
Right. So to me, I think the most powerful changes are in the kinds of tools that we now have. Um, and so the questions are more or less or very similar questions, but we now have especially kind of technological tools that we can use. So things like the uh, uh, more or less what I would call broadly corpus related types of things, where you now previously um, if you wanted to find, let's say, new instances of some pattern, it was very difficult to do. And now, of course, it's much easier, both with online tools, with corpora, with things like, I mean, the Oxford English Dictionary. I remember when I first started, the Oxford English Dictionary there was no it was available. It was just these I bought it. I spent all my money and I bought this 2 volume tiny where you had to have a magnifying glass to read it. And nowadays, I can just use all kinds of search tools that's what I do. I mean, I have the Oxford English Dictionary there and I just use my search tools to find out things that are in it. I have the COCA that's just for studying English. And so just the tools that are now available that allow people to ask questions, the computational tools that you can ask questions that you simply could not ask. And that's true not just of morphology. I think it's true of many areas of linguistics that the tools are simply much better.
Well, good. One more question that's related to your experience. I mean, your journey, which is really important, including me, especially for the young linguists. Professor Aronoff, if you could speak to, let me say, your younger academic self,
Mhm.
what would you say about the inflectional and inspirational evolution of linguistics?
Um, yeah, well, I hope that linguistics has become sort of better integrated with other areas. I mean, it's clear well, at least it was up until recently clear with computation that linguistics, as computational linguistics,
Mhm.
was much more integrated in with computer science. I mean, nowadays, and we could talk for it's not something that I could really speak to very carefully, but that the incident the large language models and AI have made those
Yes.
things are going to change a lot because of that. Um, but also um, psychology, experimental work in general. I mean, nowadays, if somebody wants to make a claim about something about language, my response is always, okay, now can you show me that people actually do this? And can you show me experimentally in some way that people are actually doing what you say they do? Which linguists, at
Yes.
least when I started out, people didn't really ask that.
Mhm. Well, yes, thank you so much for sharing your experience. So I will shift to some questions that so much related to morphology, theory, and language. So, Professor Aronoff, in your point of view, what is the most misunderstood aspect of morphology? Both within and outside the field of linguistics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, outside the field of linguistics, um, it's, well, in all of linguistics, the not just morphology, but morphology, I think is important here, is people still have these very highly prescriptive attitudes.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so in general, that even it's what I would say 150 years or more that linguists have tried to say that what we're interested in is studying real language and how real language is used. And lay people just don't understand that. And so when you talk to them about, the English language, or the Arabic language, or what they really think about most is the language that's written down, and the notion that the language that they speak is somehow equally, if not even more interesting than what is written down. I think that's sort of what, in terms of what is most understood, most misunderstood outside the field. Um, and in terms of morphology, I think that even within linguistics, there's uh, this sort of persistence of the idea that somehow morphology is something static. That it's like maybe it's a huge data set, but it's somehow like it's simply that if you really were able to, you could just take the morphology of the language at any given time and just like put it down there on some very, very large piece of paper, and that would be the morphology of the language. And I think that that's simply not the case. The morphology is much more dynamic than people like to think it is. And also, I think this sort of paradigm image that everybody has is that not just that it's static, but that um, the 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 structure is sort of there in some very kind of simple way, and that if only we could figure out what that simple thing was, that we would be able to solve it. And I think that that's simply not the case. And that there's so much that depends on sort of different sort of bits of morphology having sort of different relations to one another. I don't know if I explained that well, but
Okay, thank you so much. So let me share my screen with you to show the audience some uh, of your books, I guess.
okay.
You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
So, what is morphology? That's the second and third edition. Morphology by itself, stems and inflectional clauses. Later on, I may have a question about this book.
Okay.
And this is word formation, the handbook of linguistics, contemporary linguistics, and also the other edition. So, um, yes, sorry, back to this one. Yeah. Um, so you've written about morphology as a system by itself.
Mhm.
So in today's interdisciplinary environment, how do you see morphology interacting with syntax, phonology, and even semantics?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess, that title morphology by itself, in a way is, it was meant as a provocation, right? And if you know what's in that book, the idea in that book was to find some cases of where I thought there were certain types of phenomena that were morphology, that were not syntax, that were not phonology, they were not semantics. They were morphology. And so in that sense, it was simply trying to say, look, this exists, right? It exists, but it didn't, the title was a bad title in that I wasn't trying to say that it doesn't interact with these other things. What I was trying to say that it was its own, it was a system on its own, but that in terms of language, the only way you can understand language is by this interaction among all these systems, right? And if, as I say, if there's a fault with that title, it's that it led people to believe that I was saying that you could think about morphology without thinking about these other things, and that wasn't what I meant. What I meant was that you could separate out the morphological aspects from the syntactic aspects, from the phonological. You could, but in order to understand the whole thing, you had to understand all of it as it kind of works together. And I still believe that. And that's why I still, people who say, well, you don't need morphology. I think that, I mean, to me, that this is an empirical question, and that was what that book was about. It said, look, there are certain things that you cannot, you can't you can't talk about them in terms of other topics. That's impossible. Um,
So there's Professor, um, you have worked with both, both spoken and signed languages. So what do these different modalities reveal about the deeper cognitive structures of morphology?
yeah, so I started working on sign language. It's actually 30 years ago. So I have a colleague, Wendy Sandler, and she came here to visit for a year. And she um, she worked on sign language. She worked on sign language phonology. She's a pioneer in that field. And she came to me and we spent a year talking. And what she said was, well, there's all kinds of interesting things in morphology and sign language. So you should look at sign language because there's all kinds of interesting things. Um, and I still joke with her. She visited me just a month ago. She stayed in my house for a week, and I still joke with her saying that she had deceived me because in fact when we started looking at sign language, at first we didn't find any morphology. It was like, what are you doing? You're telling me that this is interesting, but gradually um, it came to me that, in fact, what's really interesting about sign language morphology is, in a way, it's like what's interesting about sign language phonology and sign language syntax is that because sign languages are emerging languages, new languages, what you see sort of like the beginnings, like they're just the very sort of first flowerings of these things. And so you can see, and we've seen, I think we've published stuff on this, where you can just see how um, the morphology is just beginning. It's just sort of the structure is emerging. And to me, that's the most interesting aspect of it. So this isn't morphology, it's syntax. But the very first paper that we published on this language that we studied for many years called Isaiad sign language, and we um, we saw the first thing we saw was that this language was SOV, and this was very interesting because the surrounding the local variety of Arabic is SVO, and so how did this happen? And but then over the years, we kind of began to understand why it was SOV, and that it had to do more with the structure of discourse, which is a long story. But it was the same thing with the morphology. You could actually see it beginning, and you could see, for example, certain types of compounds emerging. And so to me, that's sort of the in terms of sign language morphology, that was the most interesting thing. And now we look at other sign languages as well, and you can see how it's just the beginning. It's sort of the morphology that shows you how it works. And we've talked a lot about it in terms of self-organization, and I think that's true. I mean, I also think about it in terms of what we call play, language play, but not play in that sense, but that people just like to create patterns in things, in language, in music, um, and that sort of you can see that in sign language. You can see how these patterns emerge.
Um, well, that was really a fantastic explaining. To be honest with you, I like your answers. I enjoy your answers. You have an amazing style. Thank you so much. So, uh, another simple question, but important. Professor Aronoff, how does morphology help us understand the relationship between language structures and sorry, that was my, yeah. How, let's say, how does morphology help us understand the relationship between the language structure and human creativity?
Right. Yeah, which is, I think I was kind of getting towards that in the last response. And so one of the things that I've always sort of felt is true. So I've never liked theory. So there are theories that start with fixed inventories of things, theories of language that start with fixed inventories, like, so for example, classic generative phonology, um, um, which starts with a set of features where, that's given by God or Morris Halley, they're both equivalent. And that's this fixed set of features that you somehow that your mind is given this, and the same with certain theories of syntax, that are where there's a set of categories, which can be large or small, but that's like a fixed inventory of categories that you're given. And I've always been influenced by Lenneberg's theory, which predates Chomsky's theory of universal grammar, that it's not so much that you have a set of categories as you have a set of tools for making these things. And I think in morphology that becomes very clear because um, you create patterns, and the patterns are, in a way, they interact with your culture, right? And so um, um, a nice sort of a standard example that I give is, so if you take uh, a thing, this cafeteria, for example, um, which then is a place and then you get this, or I give it a simpler example. There's this example of like Watergate, which was a compound. It was based on some incident in American history, right? And that created a whole set of patterns of words ending in gate that means scandal, right? Um, in English. So if you look over the last 50 years, so what it is it shows you that people can create patterns, and that these patterns are to a large extent based on culture. And then the patterns just, run wild. I've always liked grammatical gender for that reason. So, people used to think, well, you have a fixed set of genders, right? There's masculine, there's feminine, there's neuter, and those are the genders that God gave you. But if you start looking at like, let's say, especially Niger-Congo languages or languages of Papua New Guinea that have many genders, you begin to realize that what's there is just this human creativity that allows you to create the categories. It doesn't give you the categories in advance. The categories aren't there. I mean, in some of the languages of Papua New Guinea that I've looked at, you have genders like words ending in P, right? And so that's what sort of, I think, to me, the most important thing about morphology is that it shows you how it actually gives you sort of direct evidence of creativity.
So what about language evolution? I mean, what role does morphology play in language evolution? And do you think that it reflects more of our biological heritage or cultural development?
Well, culture is our biological heritage.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that people, Aristotle, what he really said was that people are, he says people are social. It's translated often as people are political animals, but you could say it's translated as people are social animals. But in some sense, you could say people are cultural animals. So people our biology is such as to make us create culture. That's what our biology is, right? And so, and we do that in, in many ways, but that's what people are. People create structure in their behavior. And language is probably the most kind of central aspect of that.
Good. Uh, uh, Once more, let me share just a minute. Yes. So back to this book, not this one. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
What is morphology? So I will shift to some aspects of teaching, influence, intellectual impact, of course. So your textbook, this is really a fantastic textbook. So what is morphology? It has influenced generations of students, even linguists. So what do you think is the key to teaching complex ideas clearly and impactfully?
Right. So you asked me before about theory, and I said, what that I hope
Yeah.
that people don't think that I'm a theoretician. And I think that's reflected very, very clearly in what is morphology, because what is morphology is not there. It's not a book about morphological theory. That's not what it's about. You can look at many textbooks of morphology and they'll present a theory. The point of this book is to get you to do morphology. That's what the book is for. It's to teach you how to do morphology. And I was influenced, I have to say, the first there's a syntax book that's long out of print, but and again, you were asking me about Chomsky and Halley, and I think to me that was the most sort of important thing that I learned from them was that they mostly when they were teaching you in a classroom, they were teaching you how to do linguistics. That's what they were teaching you. They weren't teaching you ideas. They taught you how, and Ken Hale, who was another professor, that was his great contribution. And there was a textbook, a syntax textbook that I used in the days when they permitted me to teach syntax, which was Akmajian and Heaney. And again, it was a book that walked you through how to do syntax. And well, it's still one of my favorite books is Eugene Nida's Morphology, which was published in the 1940s, which again, the whole purpose of that book was to teach people how to, it was meant for field linguists who were going out and learning to analyze a new language that they'd never encountered before. And that was what the book was meant to do, was to teach you how to do morphology. So to me, if what is morphology, what makes it different from other textbooks, and what still I think I'm still proud of it, is because that's what it teaches you. It teaches you not, it doesn't give you some fixed set of ideas. It teaches you how to do morphology.
Okay, good. Well, Eugene I think, is also popular in the field of linguistics. So, Professor Aronoff, you know, this is really interesting. I mean, all this experience. So, you've mentored many students and scholars over these years. The question is that what qualities do you believe are most important in becoming a strong linguist today? I mean,
Yeah, well, I mean, the qualities which I don't think just today, well, there's certain skills that you need today that we didn't need. So you need to have strong computational skills. You need to be a good computer programmer. You need to have good, I think, a strong statistical background. And I have the luxury that I'm well enough along in my career that if I need people, that I have colleagues who can do those kinds of things with me. And so I've always been able to rely on others. But I think nowadays you really need that. The other thing I would say is, which I've said before, is you need to be able to think for yourself. you need to sort of try not to go along with the crowd. And so, because the most interesting questions, the most enduring questions and answers are the ones that you will find for yourself.
Good. Well, I have mentioned from the early beginning of the event that you've been, uh, in so many roles. For example, the president of LSA, the editor of language. So, as former editor of language and president of LSA, how did those roles allow you to shape the direction of the field beyond your own research?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think as editor of language, um, I always tried um, to, uh, to to be open-minded, right? And again, maybe again we talked about my education at MIT, and one thing I learned from that education was that was an education that was very narrow, and my reaction to it was to broaden it. And so now to me, when I was editor of language, I tried very hard to publish work that really it would be very strong empirically and theoretically, but would have broad interest, as broad as possible. And I still think that's the most important. I hope that's the most important. I think linguistics as a field in general is we always have to be careful to that what we do and what we say has to be of value, not just to some very tiny fraction, but to be of broader value. So I would say that.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Aronoff. It's nearly an hour, but uh, I really enjoy your answers. So my last question is about your reflection and your vision on future. So, what do you hope future generations of linguists will remember most about your work, and what unfinished question is would you pass to them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think about my grandchildren, and I think, what will my grandchildren think about their grandfather and what does grandpa do? What is, and to me, what I've always, I think I've always had um, a respect for the data, a respect for language as a phenomenon, and to me, I hope that's sort of something that that people will see in what I've done. That it's an attempt to actually. There was a very famous biologist who was actually from this area. Her name was Barbara McClintock, and um, she had an expression which was a feeling for the organism.
Mhm.
And that's what that was the most important quality that a researcher could have was a feeling for the organism that would guide the work. And so I guess that's what I hope people will see, that at least I I I did everything, or I've done my work based on a feeling for language.
Mhm. Uh, Thank you so much once again, Professor Aronoff. Thank you for your, sharing your experience, your visions, all this information. It seems that the audience also enjoying your speech, your answers, also encyclopedic answers. Indeed, I have so many questions in the chat box, so I will take some of them if you don't mind. I will start with a person, Parsa. Parsa Safai says, asks, would you say historical linguistics work hand in hand with morphology, and to what extent how historical linguists can help us with morphology? And thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a sense in which, and people have talked about this, is that Saussure did a great service by distinguishing synchronic from diachronic linguistics, um, but this was also a bit of a disservice because, in some sense, if you want to understand synchronic linguistics, that the diachronic aspect of it it can be very enlightening. And I mentioned Sound Patterns of English, and I think many people have criticized this book for saying, well, everything is synchronic, and so there are lots of patterns in English, in phonology of all languages, that you can only understand diachronically. And the same thing is true with morphology, that you can only recent, for example, my most recent work is that just small research project has to do with English word shortenings that end in O. And so, words like psycho, and what one of the things that I tried to do is to show how that particular pattern emerged over centuries. And if you just try and look at that thing synchronically, you don't really understand it. It's really only by going back and looking at how it gradually emerges. And I think that's generally true, certainly with a language like English, which has borrowed huge amounts of morphology. You don't borrow the patterns from Latin and Greek. You borrow the individual words, and then through time, the patterns emerge from those individual words. So yeah, I don't think that purely synchronic analysis, it just, it by restricting yourself to that, you're just leaving out a lot.
Good. So thank you. So, another question from Professor Karim says, Professor, which areas of linguistics do you think hold the most exciting opportunities for new researchers to research on in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, up until a year ago, I would have said computational linguistics. And I still think the computational linguistics is one of the most dynamic areas. Another area that I think is really important is clinical, because I think that as with any kind of science, the way in which you gain respect is by showing how people can
Pasta.
well, sorry, there's something going yeah, so I think clinical aspects, because that's how the broader public, if you say to the broader public, that broader public says, well, what is the use of what you're doing? Then the answer is, well, look, I can show you it has clinical applications. So I was just talking to a colleague today about somebody who was working on language and autism. And I've done a little bit of work on that, and I think that's a nice example of a clinical application. So I would say practical applications are really important, of all sorts.
Well, okay, good. Professor Dr. Himdad asks, given the rise of computational linguistics and AI-driven language models, what aspects of human morphology do you believe remain fundamentally unreplicable by machines?
I was thinking about this today, and it's interesting that if you look at large language models, large language models pretty much ignore morphology. I mean, I don't know, and that's in part simply because of the technology that involves word division. It's simply that large language models depend to a great extent on written language, and they depend on repeat on um, um, simple notions of adjacency that involve words. And at least as far as I know, but I mean, this is not an area that I know much about, if anything. There hasn't been much use of morphological patterns. Many years ago, I worked at IBM, and on a project that was called the Universal Dictionary, in which and the goal of that was to try and predict what new words were possible. Words that didn't occur, but if you encountered a word, you would be able to parse it. And this was a project that never really came to much. But I would love to see large language models that would be able to help us to understand new words. And I mean, these may exist. I just don't know.
Okay, good. So last question. Professor, where can you put the place of morphology in the sociocultural theory or context of language?
I'm not sure
Okay,
exactly.
let me read it. Where can you put the place of morphology in sociocultural theory or context of language?
Okay, sociocultural theory. Yeah, I think I mean, one of the things that I think is really fascinating um, is morphological innovation in as a marker of group identity, and that's always been the case. I mean, that's sort of the use things like slang, that sort of thing. But it's much more broader than slang. It's that people certain that I always say the point of language is not just to keep people together; it's to keep people apart. And one of the points of language is to create identity, and you can use morphology to create identity. And I think that's I mean, been some work on this, things like hip hop language and stuff like that. But there's some really fascinating work on that I've seen on youth language, especially like in places like in African urban youth language, where there's morphology that's being used to establish identity. And so, yeah, I mean, I believe morphology is everywhere.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Aronoff, for this. Okay, sorry. That was all the questions from the chat box. Please, if anyone of you have any other questions, you can raise your hands from the bottom of the Zoom or write down your questions in chat box. So, Professor Aronoff, yes, please. Okay, good. You can speak. Yes, Shaglan. Okay.
Great, thank you. I just have one question. I've seen, Dr. Aronoff, you described as treating words like refer, infer, defer as having two morphemes. Many linguists would say that's only one. I like your interpretation, and I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why you would see them that way and why other linguists may not.
So actually I was talking about the first work that I ever did in morphology, and that stuff was pretty much that was like the first stuff that I did. If you look at word formation and generative grammar, it's in there. And so what I mean is that it's two morphemes, not in sort of a compositional sense. So it's not like re and fer each have some separate, but it's that they each have some kind of morphological identity. So they're morphemes, not in that sort of structuralist sense of morphemes, but I was just talking to somebody about this. In Saussure would have said that those words are what we call partially motivated. That would have been Saussure's expression, meaning that there is some structure there, but it's only partial structure. It's so that you know that they're there, but they're not contributing to the meaning. Does that help?
It does help. Oh, it does help. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you so much, Professor Aronoff. Also, we have with us tonight Professor Dr. Faridun Karim, one of the pioneering in IBM. So, Professor Dr. Faridun, you can speak, please. Yes.
Okay, I was trying to open up the microphone.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not a linguist. I come from computer science. We have also our languages. Our languages are in the brain, in the CPU, is very primitive. Only talks about little things that can be done, like compare, not some logical aspects, some mathematical aspects. But then later we start growing to the natural languages, as you mentioned. What we are doing is, like you mentioned, like metaforms, like creating from these words, creating a new words that natural language people could understand. So basically, what I see. And these primitives inside, it's all comes back, all the language comes back to these primitive words which are in our brain or in the CPU brain. Then from that thing, they will combine together, develop more complex languages. Like also we have many complex computer languages before going higher to become natural language. What I'm proposing to the linguists here to think about, put this computer thing in their study, how our brain works, how our brain in the root, inside the brain, it's not these sounds. They are all ions and electronics and things inside our brain. And because they go through different compilations, you just hear my word, and it's going through all the Wi-Fi's coming to your computer, then going to your ear, all the ear, drums, all the things, and it creates waves and becomes ions and over there. Definitely, I suggest study the language from roots. We will find out most of the words we use, they are compilation. Like I'm a Kurdish guy here. I use word apple for certain things in my brain. And also I could say in Kurdish, I say seo. These two words are going back to the same root, the same thing inside my brain. It's basically, they are translators inside my brain, or we call it compilations. In our language, in computer language, we call it compilation. It's compiled to different words. So basically, what I'm trying to propose to this community,
Yes.
our language in the root are all the same thing. It's different compilation in Kurdish, in Arabic, in English, in Farsi, in Turkish, in Russian, whatever it is, they are compilation for the same roots. I don't know how right I am, how wrong I am, but I'm just putting this idea on the table for you guys.
Well, I think at some level it has to be true because after all, that we all share the same anatomy, right?
Yeah.
So at that level, it has to be true. I think to me, the most interesting aspect of this in terms of computation is how do storage and computation interact with one another? And that, like, I think that's always the basic question. Like, some things we know are computed like on the fly. Some things we know are stored, and what is the relationship, and the things that are stored, what is the structure of the entity that is stored. And so how does memory, even in the computer sense, how does memory interact with computation? And so I think that and we used to have very simple models of that because we had very simple computers, and now we get more and more powerful computers. So I think that changes the types of models that we use. So yeah.
Well, my think hypothesis goes a little bit farther than that. Uh, like the primitive words that we have inside our CPUs, it's some logic primitive, some elementary
Right.
math in there, and then we create complex things from that, languages, words, formulas, and stuff like that by different compilations. And human, when born, has several primitive actions in his brain, like suck the milk from mother and cry and do this and that, and then finally finds a sound to describe this action.
Right.
And the sound, we call it language, right? And so if it's so, maybe all languages in the root are the same. And that's why easily we are converging slowly. Like if you look at the Kurdish languages, I'm a little bit familiar with, we are bringing more words from English, from Latin, and then other English, basically English is a big example to import many words from different areas. So could be we are converging now to create one universal language.
I don't know. It's both good and bad, but we'll see. But thank
Yeah.
you.
All right.
Okay,
All
thank
right.
you so
Thank you
much.
for your time.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for your
much,
time.
Professor
Thank
Dr. Faridun. So, Professor Dr. Aronoff, I know it's I'm sorry, just only one more question that's really important for researchers concerning the morphology that I have from Dr. Abbas. Says, how are today's AI tools, particularly large language models, influencing the study and analysis of morphology in terms of identifying word structures, generating new word forms, and supporting linguistic research?
So yeah, I already touched on that. I
Yeah.
think that they should be doing that. But the problem is I'm not seeing that yet. And so this is really, I mean, a cry to my computational colleagues is to go and figure out how large language models can be helpful in understanding morphology. So please go ahead and do that.
Okay, Professor Aronoff, thank you so much once more,
Sure.
for this fascinating, amazing interview. So, my dear participants, before we close, as I said, I want to extend my deepest thanks to Professor Mark Aronoff for being with us tonight and sharing his invaluable insights. So, it has truly been an honor to learn from his experience and vision in linguistics. I also want to thank Professor Dr. Himdat. Thank you so much, dear Dr. Himdat. And also, I would like to send a special thanks to Jacob, my friend, to spreading the program of Mandarin in Linguistics across the world. So, Professor Aronoff, what do you have as your final words?
Oh my gosh. I guess my final words is that I'm grateful to you for providing me for this opportunity that allows me to think about my work. And I have to say, if I'm grateful for anything, it's besides the opportunity, is that I still think that morphology is cool, and that's I that's a gift.
Good. Thank you so much. So, my dear participants, also special thanks to you all for joining us in this amazing interview. So Minds in Linguistics is about bringing together, scholars, linguists, even students, language lovers from all over the world. And indeed, tonight has been, another step in that journey. So we will continue this exciting series and okay. So please keep an eye on your email of our Telegram channel. So thank you so much, Professor Aronoff, once more. Yes, sorry. Once again, thank you all and have a wonderful evening. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you again. Bye to all.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you all for participating.